Hi, this is John Carter, and I'll be your tour guide in this episode of the Constellations. I am an amateur astronomer and a member of the Prescott Astronomy Club in Prescott, Arizona. Let's start this presentation with the date set at February 6, 2019. The time is set at 9 p.m. The location is Prescott, Arizona. The field of view for all images is set to 90 degrees wide. Excluding the animals, which were covered in a previous episode, we will cover a total of 45 of the 88 constellations, starting with the mythical beings in alphabetical order and finishing with the artifacts in alphabetical order. Let's start this tour with Andromeda, the Princess of Ethiopia, also known as the Chained Lady. Andromeda is visible from August to January in the Northern Hemisphere. It lies between Pisces on the right and Cassiopeia on the left. Andromeda is positioned with her arms outstretched. Her head is located in the upper left corner of the Great Square of Pegasus, the winged horse, and her feet lie near Perseus, the hero who saved Andromeda. The star Alpheratz, a blue-white subgiant and the brightest star in the constellation, marks her head. The star Merak, a cool red giant, marks her hips or girdle, and the star Almach, a triple star, marks her chained foot. Next is Aquarius, the water bearer. It is below the horizon, as shown in the green area here. It sets at around 7:30 p.m., so it is only visible for a short time after sunset. For northern observers, Aquarius can be seen during the fall months. During the spring months, Aquarius can be seen by southern observers. Though generally scattered and somewhat faint, some of Aquarius's stars form groupings or asterisms. It might take some imagination to see the water bearer, typically pictured as a man on his knees pouring water from a jar. The water jar that Aquarius is holding is the easiest of the asterisms to spot. Aquarius is the 12th sign of the zodiac. The surrounding area of the sky has always been associated with water and, in ancient times, rain. As a result, it is listed as first on the Chinese and Indian calendars. As one of the most ancient constellations, Aquarius was sometimes portrayed or alluded to as Zeus, pouring the waters of life from the heavens. Auriga, the charioteer, is situated along the northern Milky Way and appears as a slightly irregular pentagon north of Taurus and between Perseus and Gemini. Best seen from October through April, it is a large fall and winter constellation in the northern hemisphere. For those living at far northern latitudes, Auriga can be seen much of the year. Its name means charioteer in Latin, referring to its similar shape to that of a charioteer helmet. Auriga is the 21st largest constellation and is mainly visible in the northern hemisphere. Its neighboring constellations are Cameliopardalis, Gemini, Lynx, Perseus, and Taurus. Pictured here is Comet 38P, Stefan Oterma, a 12th magnitude comet that orbits the Sun every 37.9 years. This is a challenging object for astrophotography. Auriga, the charioteer, has been known from ancient times and was one of the first constellations to be named. Auriga is usually shown as a man holding the reins of a chariot in his left hand and a goat and its young in the right hand. The charioteer is identified as either Hephaestus, Erichthonius, or Myrtilus. Hephaestus, the god of blacksmith and craftsman, was said to have invented the chariot. In one myth, it is said that Hephaestus, the lame god, built the chariot so that he could travel anywhere he wanted, whenever and without difficulty. The myth of Erichthonius is that he is the son of Hephaestus. It was said that he was the first man to harness 4 horses to a chariot, thus inventing the quadriga. Zeus was impressed and later placed Erichthonius amongst the stars. Next is Boötes, the herdsman. Boötes is one of the oldest recorded constellations. It was first catalogued by the 2nd century astronomer Ptolemy. To find the herdsman Boötes, follow the handle of the Big Dipper, which arcs southward to the bright star Arcturus, the brightest star in Boötes. Boötes was credited with inventing the plow. He was placed in the sky by Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, to honor this important invention. Another myth is that Boötes represents Arcus, son of Zeus and Callisto. Boötes is mentioned in the Odyssey as a bear driver chasing Ursa Major and Ursa Minor across the sky. The Greeks believed that Boötes was a grape grower named Icarius. Whatever Boötes is, it is most recognizable as the asterism known as the kite, with Arcturus at the tail. Next is Cassiopeia, the queen of Ethiopia. Cassiopeia is a fall constellation that occupies an area between the north celestial pole and the constellation Andromeda. It is a W-shaped figure, surrounded by Andromeda, her daughter, on the left, and Cepheus, her husband, on the right. Cassiopeia is said to have insulted the Nereids, or sea nymphs, by boasting that she was more beautiful than they. For part of the year, Cassiopeia is high in the sky on her throne, but during the spring months, she appears upside down along the northern horizon. It was believed that this was her punishment for her vanity and bragging. The entire group of Cassiopeia, Cepheus, Andromeda, Perseus, and Pegasus rides high in the autumn sky. Cepheus ruled over the mythical land of Ethiopia. This constellation looks somewhat like a lopsided house with a pointed roof. The 5 main stars in Cepheus are in the southwestern part of the constellation. The northern parts of Cepheus are devoid of any conspicuous stars. During the wedding of Perseus and Andromeda, Phineus, the brother of Cepheus, claimed that Andromeda was promised to him first. Perseus objected to this claim, and a fight broke out. Being outnumbered, Perseus had to report to using the head of Medusa to slay his opponents. However, Cassiopeia and Cepheus were also caught in Medusa's gaze and were turned to stone as well. Poseidon is said to have placed both Cassiopeia and Cepheus amongst the stars. Gemini is a major constellation in the winter sky. Gemini is one of the few constellations with 2 first-magnitude stars, Castor and Pollux. In Greek mythology, Gemini was named for the twin sons of Leda. The stars Castor and Pollux mark the heads of the twins. They had different fathers. Pollux was the son of Zeus, and Castor was the son of Leda's husband, King Tyndareus. And therein lies a great soap opera involving apparent infidelity and magic that only the gods can be credited for. The Gemini twins were the brothers of Helen of Troy. To add strangeness to the story, in one account, all 3 children were conceived from the same egg. Triplets, maybe? Hercules was known for his tremendous strength. He was the son of a mortal mother, Alcmene, and the god Zeus. Hera, the jealous wife of Zeus, plotted to kill the baby Hercules. She sent serpents to kill the child, but Hercules strangled the creatures. As he grew, Hercules gained great strength until he became the strongest man in the world. Hercules appears as a kneeling man, located between Draco and Ophiuchus. His foot is on Draco's head, as if ready to slay the dragon. Lyra is to the east, and Corona Borealis is to the west. Hercules is a major constellation of the spring and summer months in the northern hemisphere. Indus covers a small region of the sky south of Microscopium, to the right here, and north of Octans. to the left here. The stars in this constellation are very faint. Indus is visible only to southern observers. The south celestial pole is shown here as SCP. Indus is one of the 12 new constellations added to the celestial globe in 1597. Even though the name means Indian, it is unclear whether the name refers to the American Indians or to the native peoples of the East Indies. The constellation is usually depicted as a kneeling man holding arrows. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Ophiuchus is a summer constellation located north of Scorpius and south of Hercules. The ecliptic passes through the southern part of Ophiuchus. This makes Ophiuchus a zodiacal constellation, but it is not considered as one of the astrological signs of the zodiac. Ophiuchus was one of the 48 constellations recorded by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. Ophiuchus translates from the Latin as "he who holds the serpent," and in Greek mythology represents Asclepius, the healer. In Chinese astrology, Ophiuchus is actually composed of much of the celestial marketplace. Orion is the brightest and probably best-known constellation in the sky. The 3 stars in Orion's belt are a well-known pointer to other nearby constellations. The upper part of Orion lies within the Milky Way. Orion's belt runs through the celestial equator, the midpoint in the sky. Orion is seen marching across the winter sky, with his dogs, Canis Major and Canis Minor, following behind. Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, lies just southeast of the Hunter. The relative position of Orion in the sky sets the figure next to Taurus, and Orion is often depicted as facing off against the bull. In Roman mythology, Orion was a great hero of large stature, reputed to be the son of Poseidon. Perseus is a fall and winter constellation for observers in the northern hemisphere. Perseus is located southwest of the W of Cassiopeia's chair. It appears as a somewhat bent, V-shaped pattern of stars. The image is usually shown as the young Perseus, fully armed and carrying the head of the mortal Gorgon Medusa. More constellations are associated directly with the mythology of Perseus than with any other constellation. Perseus is one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology and precedes many of the other characters of the heroic age. The aftermath of his travels affected the journeys of many of the other Greek heroes, including the Argonauts. In GC 1499, the California Nebula is a large but visually faint emission nebula in the constellation Perseus, which gets its name from the resemblance to the USA's most populous state. The central Milky Way runs through the western region of Sagittarius. This area contains the most abundant and wide-ranging collection of deep sky objects in the sky. Like most of the zodiac constellations, Sagittarius is believed to have been recorded as far back as 1000 BCE in the ancient Babylonian astronomical compendium referred to as Mul-Apin. The Greeks believed the constellation represented both a centaur and the archer Crotus. Crotus is described as a great marksman and a friend of the Muses. Exceeded in size only by the fainter constellation Hydra, Virgo is the second largest constellation in the night sky. The constellation has many mythological associations in Greek, Roman, Chinese, and even Babylonian cultures. In Greek mythology, Virgo is primarily associated with Dike, the daughter of Zeus and Themis. Dike is the Greek goddess of justice who, having lived through the Golden Age, continually longed for its return. The constellation also contains the first 2 lunar mansions in Chinese astrology. The first is Zhao, the horn. The second is Kang, the neck. These were the first of many gates that the moon passed through. Markarian's chain of galaxies in the heart of the Virgo cluster contains M84 and M86, the brightest members. Messier 104 in the Virgo constellation is known as the Sombrero Galaxy. It is a spiral galaxy in the constellation Virgo, whose bright nucleus, an unusually large central bulge, and prominent dust ring give it the appearance of a Mexican hat. We have finished with the celestial beings of the constellations. Now let's look at the celestial artifacts of the constellations. Antlia is among the faintest of all constellations. It is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to the French astronomer Nicolas Louis de La Salle. In La Salle's posthumously published Column Australe Stelliferum, Antlia simply means pump. It was named to commemorate the invention of the air pump by French physicist Denis Papin. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Ara is among the smallest of the constellations at 63rd in size. It is made up roughly of 2 parallel lines of stars. Ara, meaning altar in Latin, is associated with the altar on which the gods swore allegiance to Zeus before going into battle with the Titans. In other stories, the altar is a reference to the altar of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia. Calum is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to the French astronomer Nicolas Louis de La Salle and posthumously published in 1763. Calum was first depicted on La Salle's map as Les Burins, a pair of crossed burins which are sharp engraving tools, connected by a ribbon. When translated in Latin, it became Cala Sculpturis, the sculptor's chisel, which later was shortened to chisel or Calum. Calum has no stars brighter than 5th magnitude. There are no prominent star clusters or nebulae in Calum. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Carina is far to the south, at mid-northern latitudes. It is only partially visible along the southern horizon. Carina is Latin for keel of a ship. Carina is one of the 3 pieces of the original Argo Navis, once the largest constellation in the sky. Argo Navis has since become obsolete in favor of the 3 constellations Carina, the keel or the hull, Puppis, the stern, and Vela, the sails. These 3 constellations were introduced by Nicolas Louis de La Salle in his 1756 Southern Star Catalog. In Greek mythology, the Argo itself is the ship that famously sailed to Colchis and back during the heroic age. One legend tells of Jason in his old age returning to the beached, rotting hulk of the Argo when part of the ship collapsed, killing Jason. Circinus, the compass, is next. Because Circinus is so far south, it is invisible to observers in most of the northern hemisphere. Circinus is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to the French astronomer Nicolas Louis de La Salle. Circinus was named after the drafting tool used for making circles, as opposed to a mariner's compass. It is represented as a pair of dividing compasses used by navigators or traders to measure distances. Circinus is a small, undistinguished constellation. It is the 4th smallest of the constellations, and it has no prominent stars. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Coma Berenices is a faint northern constellation which is high in the sky during the spring for northern observers. Coma Berenices originates from the time when Ptolemy III Euergetes ruled Egypt with his queen Berenice II, daughter of Magas, king of Cyrene. Berenice was proud of her beautiful blonde hair. She vowed to sacrifice it if her husband returned safely from a dangerous military expedition. Berenice had her hair cut when her husband returned safe from the wars. She placed her hair in the temple of Aphrodite. That night the hair disappeared, which angered the king and queen. The court astronomer Conon announced that the hair had achieved such favor with the goddess Aphrodite that, rather than keep it in the temple, she had placed the hair in the sky for everyone to see. Corona Australis is a summer constellation for northern observers. It is a semicircle of stars located south of Sagittarius, below the teapot and east of the tail of Scorpius. Corona Australis was listed by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. In Latin, Corona Australis means southern crown. However, it was known to the Greeks as a wreath or a circlet of stars near the feet of the centaur in the neighboring constellation Sagittarius. To the Chinese, Corona Australis is a tortoise. Corona Australis contains several interesting double stars and globular clusters. NGC 6726 and NGC 6727 form a complex of dark and bright nebulosity in the shape of a figure 8. Corona Borealis contains 7 stars arranged in a semicircle, resembling a jeweled crown. It is best seen from April to August. In Greek mythology, Corona Borealis is associated with the crown Dionysus gave to Ariadne, the daughter of the king of Crete. The Native American Cheyenne called the constellation Camp Circle because of the similarity in shape to the way they arrange their camp. In Arabic mythology, the constellation was known as the Bowl of the Poor People. Crux, the Southern Cross, is perhaps the most famous southern constellation. It is the smallest constellation in the sky and covers only 68 square degrees. The Southern Cross points to the south celestial pole, shown on the far right, in the same way the pointer stars of the Big Dipper point to the north celestial pole. Crux was considered part of the centaur's feet in ancient Greek times. However, it was lost to northern inhabitants after precession took it below the European horizon. The image of the constellation was found carved in stone at Machu Picchu, Peru, a site of the South American Inca culture. The Incas called the constellation Chacana, meaning stare. The open star cluster, known as the Jewel Box, is near the northern edge of the Coal Sack, the most famous dark nebula in the sky. The Coal Sack appears as a hole in the Milky Way, where the light from distant stars is obscured. It forms a nearly starless region near the bottom of the cross. Fornax lies in a rather sparse region of the sky. The constellation is surrounded by Cetus, Phoenix, and Eridanus. 3 stars create a pattern resembling a flattened V. Fornax is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. The Furnace constellation was originally named Fornax Chimica, or chemical furnace. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. The most prominent galaxy in Fornax is the beautiful NGC 1365. It is a 10th magnitude barred spiral galaxy visible in an 8-inch telescope. Horologium is a faint constellation with few stars. The hockey stick asterism is its only notable feature, and with no star brighter than 4th magnitude, it will be difficult to pick out. All galaxies in Horologium are of 10th magnitude or fainter. Horologium is said to represent a clock. It was originally named Horologium Oscillatorium, or pendulum clock, after the inventor Christian Huygens. Libra, the balance or scales, was introduced in the 1st century when the Romans adopted a new 12-month calendar. Before that time, the constellation Libra had been considered part of Girotab, the celestial scorpion. The two brightest stars in Libra are Zubin Eshimali, the northern claw, and Zubin el-Janubi, the southern claw. So now maybe we know where Star Wars got the name Obi-Wan Kenobi. Lyra includes the bright star Vega, one of the brightest stars in the northern hemisphere's summer sky. Below Vega is a parallelogram formed by 4 third-magnitude stars. The constellation Lyra represents the instrument that was said to be used by Orpheus. This mythical instrument is said to have been created by the Greek god Hermes when he came upon a turtle. The god is said to have hollowed out its shell and drawn strings across it, creating the first lyre. M57. The Ring Nebula is often regarded as the prototype of all planetary nebulae. These objects are the remains of sun-like stars which have blown away their outer envelopes, leaving planet-sized white dwarfs at their centers. Mensa is a southern constellation in a rather sparse region of the sky. The southern third of the Large Magellanic Cloud spills over into Mensa on the northern boundary. Mensa is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763 as Mons Mensae. Mensa was named for Table Mountain near Cape Town, South Africa, and is thus the only constellation named for a terrestrial feature. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Microscopium is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. Microscopium was intended to represent an early compound microscope. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. There are no prominent star clusters or nebulae in Microscopium. There are no galaxies brighter than 11th magnitude. Norma is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. La Salle first presented the constellation as L'Équerre et le Règle, which means the set, square, and rule. It was later renamed in Latin as Norma et Regula. It was eventually shortened to Norma, which means set square or carpenter's square. Taken together with its neighbor, Circinus, or the drawing compass, Circinus and Norma can form the symbol of Freemasonry. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Being situated along the Milky Way, there are several open and globular clusters in this constellation, but none brighter than magnitude 5.5, barely visible to the naked eye. Octans encompasses the south celestial pole and is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. La Salle originally introduced the name as l'octans, which means the eighth part of a circle. The original octant is a navigational instrument used in astronomy with a 45-degree arc to measure latitude and longitude, and was a forerunner of the sextant. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Pictor is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. Yes, I get to say this 14 times. Pictor was originally named Eculeus Pictoris, which translates to the painter's easel. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Puppis is Latin for stern. Puppis is one of the 3 pieces of the original Argo Navis, once the largest constellation in the sky. Argo Navis has since become obsolete in favor of the 3 constellations: Carina, the keel, or the hull, Puppis, the stern, and Vela, the sails. These three constellations were introduced by Nicolas Louis de la Salle. In Greek mythology, the Argo is the ship that famously sailed to Cochise and back during the heroic age. Captained by Jason, the great ship carried with it some 50 of Greece's greatest heroes to steal the Golden Fleece. While Pupus does not have a very recognizable figure, it does contain many bright stars. With the Milky Way running through its northern half, Pupus contains many interesting deep sky objects, such as second magnitude open cluster Colander 135, situated very close to the star Ahadi. Pisces is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. Pisces was intended to represent the invention of the magnetic compass. The instrument has played a large historical role in improving upon the navigation traditions that began with using the stars to find the poles. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. There are no deep sky objects brighter than magnitude 8 in this constellation. Reticulum is one of the 14 new constellations credited to the French astronomer Nicolas Louis de la Salle. Reticulum was intended to represent the reticle, also known as crosshairs. It is related to the constellation Telescopium, in that it is the part of the eyepiece in a telescope that was used to measure star positions. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. There are no deep sky objects brighter than 9th magnitude in this constellation. Sagitta, or Sagitta, is the third smallest constellation. It is best seen from July through November. The constellation Sagitta was recorded by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. The name Sagitta is Latin and translates as arrow. Sagitta is associated with many myths due to the arrow being a common weapon used throughout Greek mythology. Sagitta is known classically as being associated with one of two arrows. The first suggestion is proposed by Eratosthenes, in which Apollo killed the Cyclopes who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. Apollo was said to be enraged when Zeus murdered his son, Asclepius. Zeus calmed Apollo by placing his son in the heavens as the constellation we know to be Ophiuchus. The other suggestion is proposed in the Theogony. In this story, Sagitta represents the arrow used by Hercules to kill the eagle that ate the liver of Prometheus. In more modern interpretations, a legend tells of Aphrodite being shot by the arrow of Eros, who is commonly known as Cupid. There are few deep sky objects in Sagitta. M71 is a loose globular cluster of 8th magnitude. In a modest telescope, it appears as a small diffuse patch, but it can be resolved into stars in larger instruments. IC 4997 is an 11th magnitude planetary nebula in the southeastern corner of Sagitta. There are no bright galaxies in Sagitta. Sculptor is one of the 14 new constellations credited to the French astronomer Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. Sculptor was originally named L'Atelier du Sculpteur, which translates to the sculptor's studio. Please pardon my French. As a modern constellation, Sculptor has no mythology associated with it. In GC 300, an 8th magnitude galaxy in Sculptor spans nearly the same amount of sky as the full moon and is visible with a small telescope. It shows typical flowing blue spiral arms and a compact nucleus. Scutum was introduced in 1684 by Johannes Hevelius. This Polish astronomer originally introduced the constellation as Scutum Sobiescianum, which is Latin for Sobieski's Shield. Sculptor is the only constellation recognized by the IAU, whose name is derived from a non-classical historical figure. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. There are three prominent 8th magnitude open clusters in Sculptor. They are M11, M26, and NGC 6712. Sextans was introduced in 1687 by Johannes Hevelius, the Polish astronomer who originally introduced the constellation under the name Sextans Urania. A sextant is a navigational instrument with a 60-degree arc used in astronomy to measure latitude and longitude. The constellation is said to have been introduced after Johannes's house burned to the ground in 1679. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology associated with it. NGC 3115, a 9th magnitude galaxy located in the constellation Sextans, is one of two different objects known as the Spindle Galaxy. It is a bright lenticular galaxy, a smooth disk galaxy without significant spiral structure. William Herschel discovered NGC 3115 on February 22, 1787, and numbered it as H1.163. Telescopium is one of the 14 new constellations accredited to Nicolas Louis de la Salle and published posthumously in 1763. Telescopium was intended to represent an aerial telescope that involved a long suspended refractor. It has since been shortened and no longer extends between Sagittarius and Scorpius. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Personally, I would prefer a more modern image for the telescope. Triangulum simply means triangle in Latin. Introduced by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, its name comes from the triangular shape of three relatively bright stars. The Greeks referred to it as deltotron, due to its similarity to their capital letter delta. Perhaps the most creative justification for such an unimaginative constellation belongs to Eratosthenes, who claimed the constellation represented the Nile Delta. M33 is the one prominent galaxy in Triangulum. It is a spectacular spiral galaxy known as the Pinwheel Galaxy. It is seen face-on with wide, irregular spiral arms filled with dark clumps and bright knots. Triangulum Australe is one of the 12 new constellations accredited to Pieter Dirkzoon Keizer and Frederik de Houtman. It was used by sailors in the southern hemisphere. Its three brightest stars form a nearly equilateral triangle useful in navigation. As a modern constellation, it has no mythology of its own. Finishing up our tour of the constellations is Vela. Vela, Latin for sails, is one of the three pieces of the original Argo Navis, once the largest constellation in the sky. This large constellation was plotted originally by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. The ship is depicted in a variety of different ways that justify the missing prow of the ship. There are a number of open clusters in Vela, starting with the 2nd magnitude Omicron Velorum cluster and another 25 appearing into the 9th magnitude, with one lonely globular cluster, NGC 3201.